That we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. This land is stolen land, and in Victoria we are working towards a treaty, and I know it will be difficult, but I also know that there are many people in this room and outside this room who will work their butts off to make that happen. I'm Sarah Mackenzie, I'm the Acting Executive Director of Per Capita, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today Sean Scalmer. He's a Professor of History at University of Melbourne, and he's the author of 7 books on labour and social movement matters. But this book that we are going to hear about today is A Fair Day's Work. It's really well timed and really well located. We are, of course, just 50 metres away from the site where on the 21st of April 1856 we really saw the birth of reduced working hours, and that idea that a decent work life is more than just what is happening at work, but what is happening at home and how you rest and how you are a human being. But today we're shifting towards a different world. We've got the Productivity Roundtable on at the moment, and there's ideas around shortening work weeks, which I'm sure we might hear a little bit about or questions about. But we are at a point now where workers are working harder than they have in the past. There's more multiple job holders than ever before. And we know that something needs to change, but to make change, we need to understand our history, what we did well and what we did poorly. And Sean has an amazing way of tying in the past into our future, but I will leave it to him to talk to you all. So please join me in welcoming Sean to speak about his wonderful book. Thank you.
All right, it's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a long-term admirer of John Cain for his bold reforming visions and also for his sense of decency and commitment. And I'm also an admirer of Per Capita, and in fact I draw upon some Per Capita research in my book, so it's especially pleasing for me to be here. I also want to acknowledge that we're assembling on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. As has been explained, my talk is based on my new book, A Fair Day's Work, The Quest to Win Back Time. And I thought I'd just divide my talk into 3 uneven slices. First off, I'll just explain briefly what led me to write the book. Then I want to draw out 3 findings that I think are especially significant and might be of interest to you. And then finally, I want to draw out some implications from the book for contemporary debate and contemporary reform that hopefully will then start to generate your questions and your ideas and a useful conversation. So, why write the book? The book is my response as an historian to an ongoing social crisis. Since the 1980s, Australians have increasingly lost control of their hours of work. Though the formal standard of a full-time employee is 38 hours per week, on average those employees work 4.1 hours of unpaid overtime every week. The rise of the gig economy and insecure work has meant that many Australians are forced to piece together multiple jobs and to jump to an employer's command. Meanwhile, the growth of our cities and the weaknesses of public transport on the city fringes mean that on average Australians spend more time commuting to work than workers in Europe or even in the United States. The burdens of labour are especially great for Australian women, for they continue to shoulder the bulk of the domestic load. On average, women do over 9 hours a week more unpaid household work than men. And social surveys, not surprisingly, disclose widespread problems of exhaustion. An OECD analysis of the work-life balance places Australia 7th last out of 38 member countries. And of course, these developments sit in great contrast with the long-cherished vision of Australia as a reforming workers' paradise in the 19th century and as the place that pioneered the 8-hour day. So my book is my response as an historian to these issues. It's organised around the quest for a fair day's work from the 19th century to the present. And it seeks to trace long-term patterns of change and to place contemporary developments in a longer historical perspective. It also seeks to explain how and why hours of work have sometimes been reduced and sometimes have expanded. And I hope that this historical investigation will contribute to ongoing and I think increasing efforts to make change that are especially evident over the last few months. So that's why I did it. Let me draw out three significant findings. First off, I'll just emphasise, of course, that A Fair Day's Work is a history book, and the value of history lies partly in the clarity of its reconstruction and the richness of its narrative. And that doesn't always translate easily into a kind of a list of bullet points or the brevity of a lunchtime address. But I want to draw out three significant findings that I think capture some of the historical discoveries that most surprised me, and that also have some implications for contemporary debates over work and productivity and equality. The first of those is I'm calling an uneven, discontinuous history. Between the mid-1850s and the late 1940s, the standard hours of work fell from around 60 to around 40. And this occurred in three steps. From 60 hours a week to 48 hours a week, that is from a 10-hour day to an 8-hour day. From a 48-hour week to a 44-hour week, that is the winning of a half-day holiday, especially on Saturday afternoons. And from 44 hours to 40 hours, a 5-day week and a modern weekend. But the recitation of these steps and the celebration of the victories of 1856 sometimes overstates the ease of that forward march, because this was a highly uneven, discontinuous and contested process over those decades. Of course, a few stonemasons in Sydney achieved an 8-hour day with a loss in pay in 1855, and then more famously and more significantly, in April 1856, Melbourne stonemasons and fellow members of the building trades attained an 8-hour day without a loss in pay. But the extent of these breakthroughs and their implications for the workforce as a whole, their immediate implications, shouldn't be overstated, because the success of Melbourne's building workers was at first provisional and relatively isolated. The 8-hour standard was not rapidly attained by those outside the building industry, and it remained a fragile achievement vulnerable to employer attack. In 1862, only 300 or 400 unionists took part in the annual procession in Melbourne to reaffirm success, and opponents circled, including leading employers who were also leading Conservative politicians. Addressing workers in 1869, the Vice President of the National Short Hours League admitted, quote, he was sorry the movement had not progressed more, end quote. And that year, members of only 12 unions marched on Melbourne's 8-hour day. In 1879, still only 17 unions in Melbourne had secured the standard, and it was only in the 1880s that victories began to multiply. So by 1885, 34 separate unions marched in Melbourne to celebrate an 8-hour day. In 1888, there were 48, and by 1891, there were 60. But it's very, very clear when you look closely that employees in Melbourne very much led the way, and the progress elsewhere was generally much slower and more uneven. A strike to win an 8-hour day for Sydney ironworkers in 1861 spectacularly failed, seriously retarding the campaign for the next decade. Tradesmen from Melbourne migrating northward to Sydney in the middle 1860s complained that the 8-hour system did not even apply across most of the building industry. As late as 1883, only 10 trade societies took part in Sydney's 8-hour celebrations. And I could go through other colonies, but the general point is that they lagged much behind Victoria. And differences persisted even into the early years of the 20th century, when many employees still laboured much longer than 8 hours a day. Most Aboriginal workers, Pacifica workers and Chinese workers did not fully enjoy the protections of an 8-hour day, and 8 hours was at first presented as a racialised standard and a means of contrasting the white worker with the non-white. Occupations dominated by women employees also sometimes required more than 8 hours labour. This was true, for example, of nurses, of barmaids, of waitresses. And 8 hours was at first a gendered standard that, of course, bracketed out public discussion of the labour and work of the home. The advance from 48 to 44 hours a week was perhaps even more twisted and uncertain. A 44-hour week was attained by a few of the building trades in the 19th century, but then forfeited by nearly all craft workers in the Depression of the 1890s. It was sought purposefully and unstintingly from the second decade of the 20th century and won by a few occupations by direct industrial action. But this victory was not easily won by strikes, and it was extended to many workers by legislation. Precisely because it was extended by legislation, it also proved especially vulnerable to rescission. Laws passed to guarantee a 44-hour week in New South Wales were passed by a Labor government in 1921, but then repealed by a Conservative government in 1922, re-established by a Labor government in 1925, removed by the Conservatives in 1930, and finally reimposed by Labor in 1931. So we sometimes think about, the climate wars over legislation as being complex, but these wars over hours in the 1920s were even more closely fought through Parliament. Legislation initiated by a Labor government in Queensland was also subject to reversal, although here Labor's grip on office was more secure, and so the standard was also more secure as well. If the use of the legislature was an uncertain means to win reductions, the courtroom was little more reliable. Under arrangements established in the years after the Great Strikes of 1890s, as is well known, colonies and then the Commonwealth established courts of arbitration empowered to set wages and conditions by judicial fiat. H.B. Higgins, the second president of the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration from 1907, was especially influential. When employees worked very long hours, Higgins consistently reduced these to 48 in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Then, in the years after World War I, he also began to grant claims for a 44-hour week, reducing the standard hours of timber workers in 1920 and of engineers soon afterwards. But Higgins' judicial activism in 1920 provoked outrage, and the Commonwealth government, led by Billy Hughes, took fright. It pushed through an amendment to the Conciliation and Arbitration Act 1920. This made it impossible for a single judge to reduce standard working hours below 48 per week, and henceforth these reductions were only possible if supported by a majority decision of the court's president and 2 deputy presidents. Higgins, of course, resigned from the arbitration court soon afterwards in what was sometimes seen as a protest at this change. And new appointments to the bench made by Hughes rapidly overturned the reductions Higgins had made and re-established a 48-hour week. Even in 1930, statisticians calculated that the standard working week for male adults was 45.98 hours per week. It wasn't until 1939 that the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration declared that, quote, the 44-hour week should be accepted as the standard for Australian industry. By comparison, the 40-hour week arrived more decisively and universally. A judgment of the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration in 1947 instituted the 40-hour week as a general standard from the beginning of 1948. But even this advance was preceded by mass strikes, by selective breakthroughs in particular industries, and by prior legislation in New South Wales and in Queensland. So my overall first point is that the progress to reduced hours was never a relentless forward march, but always a complicated advance marked by frequent interruption and retreat. And events since the 1940s have deepened this point. A very long campaign for a 35-hour week was initiated by the ACTU in 1957, and it resulted in some important victories, but relatively few victories. Most employees attained only a 38-hour week from the early 1980s. And since then, as we've already heard, the situation for many workers has worsened. From the early 1980s, standard full-time hours worked began to increase to an average of 41.2 hours in 1988 and to 45 hours by 1994. Though they've fallen back unevenly in the years since, they remain above the levels that prevailed 4 decades ago. So historical research demonstrates that the setbacks since the 1980s are greater and more protracted than earlier decades, but it also shows that every advance has been contested, difficult, and vulnerable to reversal. My next finding relates to the arguments that the advocates of reduced hours have put forward to the public debate around working time, because it's, I think, a fascinating history in and of itself. The first point to make is that supporters of reduced hours never simply pled for lightened labours. Rather, they advanced really detailed, sophisticated arguments to justify their claims. And they put those arguments in public meetings, in pamphlets, in newspapers, in books, in submissions to government and to courts, and in important speeches on the floor of Parliament. Their arguments for reduced hours were never static or unchanging. Rather, they developed and were modified over time. And in the research and writing of the book, I discovered three distinct and powerful arguments for reduced time at work. The first was a claim for human rights. It dominated public debate from the 1850s through to the early 20th century. The second argument tied reduced hours to technological change and to productivity. It emerged from the late 19th century, became dominant in the early 20th century, and remained important into the 1980s. The third argument connected work for pay with caring work and household labour. It was raised by Australian women as early as the 1850s, but it only won widespread attention from the 1970s. So one contribution I try to make in the book is to recover the intellectual richness of these Australian debates over working time. Another is to try and trace the historical and political forces that elevated some arguments and suppressed others. So let me briefly outline each of the arguments put for reducing hours at work. The first of these was this argument for human rights. Advocates from the 1850s argued that a rich human existence was distinguished by more than work. They declared it also extended to other experiences and other possibilities. They emphasised that to be human was to enjoy the experience of autonomy, that is, the capacity to make free choices about what we might do. They said to be human was to have a brain and a capacity to learn new things. And so it involved the activities of intellectual discovery and of self-education. They said to be truly human was to play a role in self-government. And so it needed to allow for a place in the democratic polity. And they said to be human is to be embedded in familial relationships and in social relationships that give our lives meaning. So these arguments were summed up in the words of the radical stonemason and MP, the first working class MP in the British Empire, Charles Jardine Donne, who argued in 1858 in a notable speech that life should be more than work, eat and sleep. So campaigners for an 8-hour day argued that very long labours, that is the labours that they had to endure at the time, made it impossible to share in these possibilities, in these things that truly made us human. Workers had no opportunity to exercise their capacities. Their humanity was denied. And as a result, they argued they were reduced to the status not of humanity, but of being like an animal, a machine or a slave. And those metaphors around an animal, a machine or a slave recur again and again in the speeches and pamphlets and in some of the artworks as well. By imagining the battle for reduced hours as a quest for full humanity, campaigners invested this issue with great significance. And this, of course, drew more supporters to the cause. It also ensured that those who argued for less time at work could present their efforts as a battle for social justice, not for mere self-interest. The emphasis on human rights helped to propel the movement for an 8-hour day into the centre of political and social discussion, where it lay for most of the latter half of the 19th century. However, from the late 19th century, arguments of these kinds increasingly began to carry less weight. A new set of arguments focused on productivity and machinery began to dominate discussion. And I think this change was driven by several forces. The first of those was the new aims in campaigns around working time. Having attained the 48-hour week, workers obviously sought further reductions to 44 and to 40 hours and beyond. But it was harder to argue that an employee working 48 hours was treated as a slave or an animal, and that a reduction of a further 4 or even 8 hours would fundamentally change their status. So new arguments were therefore necessary to try and justify the campaign for a full weekend. There are also counter-arguments. So employers strongly argued that if a 40-hour week might have been affordable, as it had been proved, a 44 or a 40-hour week, they said, would not be affordable. So supporters of further reductions therefore needed to find some way of combating these views, and especially of offering a compelling economic and financial response. And this drove attention to new matters like productivity. This was also a moment, of course, of the establishment of new institutions. So Labor parties formed from the early 1890s, and a new system of conciliation and arbitration emerged soon afterward. These developments made Parliament and the courtroom increasingly important venues to pursue reductions in hours. But these venues weren't always receptive to arguments organised around abstract claims to human rights, and especially the courtrooms particularly rewarded statistical and technical evidence. And this drove a change in how some campaigners began to present their arguments. This was also a period, of course, of industrial change. From the late 19th century, machinery increasingly transformed production. This robbed workers of their autonomy, and it frequently made the experience of work noisier and dirtier. It made workers more productive, but it also made old skills redundant, precipitating unemployment for some. And in this new context, the question of working time increasingly took on new implications to do with the experience of work and the dangers of joblessness. Finally, there was an intellectual change evident. In the early 20th century, German-born engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor drove a new concern with what he called the rational organisation of the labour process, what became known as scientific management. This emphasised the close measurement of all aspects of production. Soon afterward, industrial sociologists and medical specialists also began to measure work and workers more intensively, seeking to better understand how the human body interacted with machines and how human fatigue might influence productivity. And in particular, this concept of fatigue and fatigue at work became the keynote of many discussions. This research created a new language and new data to discuss working time, and it was eagerly grasped by those seeking to reduce time at work below 48 hours, especially as much of this new research increasingly demonstrated that reducing hours at work might actually increase productivity. So that led to an increasingly dominant argument from the early part of the 20th century that linked technology, productivity, and reduced hours. The new argument for a shorter working week developed slowly, but was increasingly dominant by 1919. In that year, an influential government publication described a shift from what it described as a shift from a humanitarian approach to working time to what it called a, quote, scientific perspective on the matter. The new arguments for a shorter working week foregrounded the double-sided nature of technological change. So campaigners argued that if new machines were truly more productive, then this made further reductions in working time possible. They further argued that if new machines made work more dangerous and unpleasant, and if they threatened to displace employment, then this made further reductions in working time just as well as practicable. Now, this advocacy around working time through the lens of productivity and technology, I think, lacked some of the kind of poetry of the 19th century campaigns that focused on human rights. But its basis on the scientific method and in statistical proofs granted it an authority and a prestige in the public sphere that helped to sway governments, courtrooms, and even some businesses. It underpinned an increasing consensus that it was possible to reduce working time and that this might aid rather than retard economic growth. There's a third argument for reduced working time that becomes more prominent. From the 19th century, even as the campaign for an 8-hour day gathered strength, many Australian women attempted to widen its social vision and to draw attention to the labours of the home. In 1861, Carolyn Chisholm argued that the early closing question, that is the hours kept by shops, also raised what she called the home question, that is the hours and routines of household labour. In the Bendigo Advertiser early in 1884, as the 8-hour movement was winning its most stunning successes, an anonymous female correspondent put the matter most directly and passionately. Quote, "There's been one class of humans totally overlooked. I allude to womankind. Those female bipeds have to do their 16, 17 and 18 hours the whole round of the year, weekday and Sunday. There's scarcely a thing from scrubbing the floor to physicking a baby that a woman is supposed not only to know, but to do and keep on doing until the oils or machinery run dry and she stops forever." End quote. So my book traces in detail the regularity with which Australian women sought to raise these issues. It also chronicles the failure of labour movement institutions to prioritise these matters and the unwillingness of many political leaders to debate these questions. It was really only in the 1970s that the labours of the home began to be more fully recognised as work, and it was only at this time that they began to be included in discussions around working time. So my book examines this process in some detail, and it explores how the women's liberation movement developed independent institutions that enabled more systematic and continuous activism around these matters. It further traces how the pressures of Australian women and their allies in the union movement led to attention to new perspectives on working time, such as the necessity of paid parental leave, the need for carers leave, and the need for flexible work routines and sometimes reduced hours that reflected not just the priorities of employers, but the rhythms of caring for others. While the book gives detailed attention to these important arguments, my primary conclusion is that this activism has not yet won necessary change. If Australia was in the vanguard of attempts to win an 8-hour day and a 40-hour week, it's been a laggard in the reshaping of working time to recognise the central role of caring work. The presentation of rational arguments around working time that advocates put from the 19th century through to the very present was never sufficient to win reductions in working time. It also, you'll not be surprised to learn, required vigorous social and political struggle alongside effective argument. And one contribution I try and make in this book is a close analysis of the strategies workers and their allies pursued to win back time. That analysis is embedded in a narrative of change across a century and a half, but I want to draw out a few of the more striking insights. The first of these is that the attempt to win back time was never a narrow industrial campaign, but was always a more expansive social movement. So if you look back to the 19th century and beyond, you're struck by the sense in which this was a movement that involved a strong cultural dimension. There were so many poems written and published, banners designed and carried aloft, songs written and performed, and civic rituals invented, most notably our 8-hour day celebrations. Alongside those cultural discoveries and that cultural activism was a wide-ranging industrial mobilisation. Of course, many unions were actually formed to win an 8-hour day, but alongside their formation, they took action, not only undertaking strikes, but also what the industrial relations experts call unilateral regulation, that is just saying we will only work a set amount of hours, no matter what. There are also many boycotts of employers that refused to respect an 8-hour day. There were go-slows and work-to-rule campaigns. And politics and political mobilisation were central from the very beginning. There were a large number of 8 hours leagues and 8 hours associations and short hours associations that were formed across the 19th century to reinforce the union struggles. These organisations often intervened in election campaigns to try and push the question of hours of work. This is in the years before a Labor Party was formed. And of course, once a Labor Party was formed, that drew so many working class activists. There was a struggle to ensure that reduced working time was prominent on Labor platforms, and there was also pressure on Labor parliamentarians to respect that platform and to implement change. My second focus on strategies of change relates to a focus on common rule or a common right. I think it's notable that successful campaigns for reduced hours were always framed as the pursuit of a common right or a common standard. So an 8-hour day for all, a half-day holiday for all, a 40-hour week, a 38-hour week. Employers, of course, always emphasised that particular industries or occupations made reduced hours impossible. But unions and their allies kept up the pressure to make reductions universal and eventually won the way. Universality or near universality made industrial gains less vulnerable to rescission. It also helped to make the campaign a basis for collective unity. My third point about strategies for change relates to the state, because I want to underline that the state played a key role in the extension of the movement from its very beginnings. So we know the story of 1856 on the 21st of April, when workers left University of Melbourne and marched towards Parliament House to ensure that all building workers would enjoy an 8-hour day. What's sometimes less known is that the Victorian government agreed to compensate building contractors for any losses they might incur from the 8-hour system. So the government took action in 1856 to support the union struggle. The movement successfully spread beyond the skilled workers of the building trades to unskilled workers in Victoria in the early 1870s. And it spread precisely because the government agreed that government contracts, including for railway building that employed so many navvies, should insist on an 8-hour day. Then, in the early 1880s, a Royal Commission initiated by the Victorian government became a public platform for employees in shops and factories to draw attention to their long hours and to demand redress. And the Victorian government responded with legislation that had its limits, but nonetheless attempted to limit hours enjoyed or suffered by certain employees, like young people and women, and certain occupations, like in factories and shops. And these Victorian breakthroughs actually then became models for other colonies and also even for reformers in Europe, the UK and the United States. Now this continues the role of the state into the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, as I noted earlier, legislation by Labor governments in New South Wales and in Queensland helped to make an 8-hour day a common standard and then to mandate a 44 and a 40-hour week. Alongside the legislature, campaigners also used the arbitration system and industrial courts to advance their quest. Sometimes, although too rarely, sympathetic judges like H.B. Higgins were willing to pioneer reductions in working time. More commonly, courts were used to extend the victories won by powerful unions and well-organised employees to weaker groups. My final point in relation to strategies of change is that from the early 20th century, campaigners increasingly recognised the import of pursuing interconnected struggles across industrial, political and legal domains. Each tool, industrial, political and legal, aided the use of the other tools. So industrial action could be used not just to convince or to compel given employers, but also to precipitate judicial intervention and legislative reform. New laws in particular states, most notably New South Wales and Queensland, were sometimes cited as precedents for Commonwealth-wide legal judgments in the arbitration court. They also inspired industrial action by those who did not directly benefit. And path-breaking judgments by Justice Higgins and others were sometimes cited by Labor politicians intent on framing general laws. Now, this interactive logic connecting the industrial, political and legal was most strongly evident in the achievement of the 40-hour week. This arrangement was codified in a judgment of the arbitration court delivered in September 1947. But it did not rest simply on the justifications ventured in the courtroom, but relied also on events and forces exerted outside. The court's formal judgment referenced the prior existence of legislation guaranteeing a 40-hour week for employees in New South Wales and Queensland, along with the support of several Labor governments for this reform, including the Commonwealth Government. And this was used to justify the court's decision. Moreover, the ACTU had announced an intention to undertake a general strike on October 20, should the arbitration court not deliver on unions' demands. And it further threatened that workers would limit their labours to 40 hours no matter what the court decided. So the court's judgment in 1947 noted that the campaign for 40 hours had generated substantial unrest, and then that in the absence of a new settlement, it would likely go on doing so. There's no question that this possibility weighed heavily upon the judges. They openly admitted that any refusal would provoke, quote, unrest sufficient to reduce production quite substantially. So that, quote, the difference between what might have been produced in a 44-hour week on rejection of these claims and what will be produced in a 40-hour week if they be granted is likely on this ground alone to be substantially lessened. So I just want to conclude by drawing out some implications that I took from the research, although I'll be interested in your own views about these things. I want to draw out 4 conclusions that struck me as I worked on this book over a number of years. The first of those, a pretty obvious one, but I think an important one, is this sense of historical contrast. The quest to win back time sat at the centre of public discussion and much action from the 1850s until the 1980s. It was the primary cause of union mobilisation, it was central to national self-identity, and it helped to turn major election campaigns. It was a wildly successful movement and helped to ensure that standard hours were reduced by more than 1/3. The contrast with the period that runs from the 1980s until the COVID pandemic is marked. The hours of work increased, working time became more fragmented, and the necessity for some collective and social response rather than individual improvisation was largely obscured. I hope that we're now at the beginning of a swing back to public debate and action, and I'm especially encouraged by recent developments like the ACTU's announcement of support for a 4-day week, by the federal government's legislation for a right to disconnect, and by the Victorian government's support for a general right to work from home. But obviously I think more action and campaigning beyond these things is urgently required. My second implication or conclusion relates to the connection between argument and action. Since the 1850s, 3 distinct arguments have been advanced for reduced working time, and I've mentioned them: human rights, productivity, and caring work and gender equality. Since the 1970s, arguments around caring work and gender equality have become more prominent. However, they have not led to necessary change, and the step from argument to action has been greatly delayed. Equally, older arguments around human rights and productivity have also been marginalised, and in my view, they merit recuperation because they can also enrich our understanding of the benefits of reducing working time and the justice of the claim. My third point relates to the institutions we might use to try and change things. Across the 20th century, the reduction of hours was driven by 3 institutions: trade unions, the Labor Party, and courts of arbitration. Since the 1980s, as hours have increased, these institutions have sometimes been weakened or have changed. If necessary changes to working time are to be made, I think these institutions need to be strengthened or reshaped, or both. Finally, a view on strategies for change. In earlier decades, working time was reduced, I've tried to emphasise, by the interlocking of political, industrial and legal strategies, so that no single mechanism was ever sufficient. And in my view, this has important implications for our own struggles. Over the last few years, a few trade unions have begun to win advances in the battle to win back time, including trials of the 4-day week negotiated by the ASU and the FSU at individual workplaces. Past experience suggests that additional workers will not come to enjoy equivalent successes without more vigorous support from the political realm. I think there's great potential for a trial of 4-day working week in government enterprises at local, state and Commonwealth, including in the context of technological changes around artificial intelligence. This holds out the possibility of reform that might address great social pressures faced by many Australian workers, especially Australian women workers. My book shows that this would also be in harmony with past Australian experiments and principles. That is with what Anthony Albanese has begun to call the Australian way. Thank you for listening.
Beck, would you like to grab the microphone? We'll now go to questions as normal, but thank you very much for the presentation. That was wonderful. Anybody who has a question on... Wait, with the microphone so we can use our people. Yeah, so Beck will give you the microphone.
Okay, I mean, you can hear me even without this.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, but we've got people joining from home, so...
Thank you for reminding me, thank you. I mean, two sectors were excluded right through. In fact, in some places they might still be excluded now, and that is the Pacific Islanders and Aborigines, completely out of all this. In fact, when a couple of groups of Aborigines left the stations they were living in and working in, with their families as well, the police was sent to bring them back from another city where they had gone, or town. So, another book?
Well, it's something I also cover in the book. Whether or not I cover adequately, I guess readers can decide. But yeah, one of the things I explore is precisely those experiences and exclusions, and also the way in which actually, when it was first framed, some of the 8-hour-a-day celebrations were very strongly marked by an emphasis on whiteness. So some of the leading, I talk about, for example, one of the processions in Melbourne in the early 20th century, where they had confectionist workers. This was just around the time of the Pacific Islanders Labourers Act and the expulsion of Pacific Islander workers. So they had the unionists dressed in all white, carrying white milk pails, and it being described as a triumph of whiteness. So also at different moments there were workers carrying signs and colours that signalled different parts of the community. I talk about in the book how Chinese employees were forming their own trade unions to fight for reduced hours, but that was often neglected and opposed by white trade unionists. So yeah, the racial dimension and racial exclusion is absolutely a big part of this history that I do try and give attention to, and I agree it's important to note that in any history.
Thank you.
If I just make 2 or 3 points. First of all,
Question as well, Max.
one thing you haven't referred to was how we won the extra week of annual leave. When I started working as an apprentice, it was 2 weeks. And then as a shop steward in the metal industry, we had big campaigns for the extra week and then the 4th week. Now, in my experience, they were very attractive. Workers liked them much more than, say, the 38-hour week, until we organised as a 19-day fortnight, because it was a block of leave, and that was, I think, some good victories and big campaigns.
Yep.
Secondly, the points you make about the Commission reinforce the view which we exploited in the metal industry, how the Commission very rarely makes a decision out of the blue. It, despite all the industrial action, it says this is what's already happening, and they recognise, hence the importance of establishing it first, which incidentally Bob Hawke was very supportive of it in the Commission, presenting all the evidence where it already existed. The final point I'd make is how all these things get corrupted. And for example, I'm very angry over many, many years in the construction industry. It's a sham. I mean, they have a 3-day fortnight, a 3-day weekend every fortnight, but then they work every Saturday and every other week, so on huge overtime and all of that. And so, and I've argued with them. They claim, well, look, we've shortened hours. They haven't at all. In fact, they work longer, and all that really undermines the whole movement, and it's hard to get unity on it.
Yeah.
But it's thank you very much. I didn't get to your launch the other week, but I'll get the book. It's great.
Oh, well, actually, you haven't missed the launch because it's in September, so I'd love to see you there if you can. But thanks for making all those points, Max. I think I agree with you across the board. They're all important issues. And I guess they do raise questions for contemporary campaigns for winning back time about the extent to which, the 4-day week is the kind of organising notion, but for many workers, it might be extended holidays rather than 4 days every week that might be the thing that they want most. And obviously, the more that union campaigns can reflect what people want to make their lives work better, the better. I'm just trying to think of the other points that you made. The commission, yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And the third one was...
Oh, yeah, it's been undermined.
Yeah, well, I actually talk about, I mean, it's just an aside, but my experience, my father was a truck driver, and one of the things that I recall as a young man or young boy was him going on very long trips in order to get a colour TV in the middle 1970s. So I very much agree that these things were, one, to create a space for for our life outside work, but then what happened in practice is that for many people trying to make ends meet or trying to have a slightly better life meant that the value of the overtime payment just becomes part of how you think about the weekly wage. So obviously campaigns for reduced time need to also think about the wage and whether we're earning enough. And obviously also, I mean, you know better than me that the Metals campaigns in the 70s tried to do both those things.
Terrific talk, Sean. But I was thinking about the campaign now for a four-day week. And of course, all the voices immediately burst out from the employers. But what worries me is that so many of our employers are small business. And for them, increasing demands from legislation about hours and working conditions and occupational health and safety become marginally really difficult. And I'm just wondering whether we need to start rethinking the 7-day week. I mean, the idea of a weekend and having Sunday off came from Sabbatarianism, which was the demand that you had the right to go to church on Sunday, and the other one was that you could go to sport on Saturday afternoon, and that was one of the great hardships for working class people in the 20s, that they couldn't go to the footy. Now the footy is at night and we start during the week. People don't go to church anymore. We're having a revolution technologically with AI. Do we need to rethink the whole week or fortnight in a way so that the economy actually ticks over 7 days a week at full bore, and that you distribute your workforce differently? I've got a son-in-law who works for the museum. He works 3 days in the middle of the week and he's on a weekend shift every fortnight. There's those sorts of things, but in running a commercial business, we've now got to shops being open 7 days a week. Are there going to be potential advantages and cost reductions, in fact, maximising the way the economy works in terms of services and so on? So I just wondered.
Yeah, I think that's definitely should be part of the conversation, and it's interesting again that these discussions have a longer history. So some of the arguments for a 6-hour day in the early part of the 20th century were based around this idea that you could have multiple shifts and you would make better use of technology at the same time as it would be more flexibility and reduced time for workers. So yeah, I definitely agree that depending upon the nature of the business, it's going to be different constraints, different pressures about how you might redistribute and limit work. I suppose my broader point would be that we've had a shift under the term flexibility. We've had a shift that's been all towards employers, with employees having to be flexible and shift in order to meet what they want. And that I think the big thing that I get from looking at this history in detail is it's when there's pressure from below across industrial and political and cultural realms that then it forces employers to take our needs seriously. And then they often find a way. I mean, one of the interesting things is looking at, say, the bakers in the 19th century. They were saying, well, we have to work 14 hours a day because of the nature of our industry. And then when the pressure came on the 8 hours movement, they found technological fixes and new ways of doing things that did make it possible. So I guess that's sort of, I guess, the overall point I'm trying to make. But I agree with you that, there's got to be more discussion about variety as well.
Thanks. Sean, it's such a great book. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to read a little passage out of it because I don't imagine when you started thinking about this project, you imagined that it would be released a week before the National Productivity Roundtable. What extraordinary timing. And I know there's a lot of cynicism in the community about what's going to come out of that roundtable, and particularly on the left we hear today, oh, Labor's so timid these days, like as if that's something new. You wrote, and this is from 1915, the apparent timidity of the Labor parliamentarians was a common lament. Though nominal representatives of the movement and of the class, their election depended also on appeals to other groups, small business people, farmers, salaried staff, nationalists, charged with retaining the financial confidence of the capitalist class. They hesitated to break with received wisdom. And in a week when we've heard, I think Andrew McKellar describe the 4-day week proposal as a radical fantasy, what lessons do we need to take from these campaigners of the past so that we overcome that cynicism, recognise that there was never a time when the capitalist class welcomed shorter working weeks, and understand what's required to give our leaders the confidence to move towards that change over time? Oh, and also, just briefly, can you comment on the fact that, according to you, there'd be no AFL without a short work?
Yeah, well, that was, I mean, to take the easier one first, the sporting one, that was again one of the really interesting things, that some of the founding cricket clubs had names like Early Closing Cricket Club or 8-Hour Day Cricket Club. So yeah, the pride that we have in sport in our community is a direct reflection of those industrial and political campaigns. How can we try and convince employers and our political leaders to take the risk? Well, I think that history does show that every reduction has had its critics in the business community have said this is impossible. We will go out of business. It's had people saying, you know, Australia is well ahead of everywhere else, and you know, we're not going to be able to compete internationally. And those prophecies were wrong. That when workers were able to win improvements, this put pressure on employers to do more than just count profits and to actually do their work as business leaders and to find more effective, productive ways of working together with their staff. So I'd insist on that as a kind of a general principle. I'd also hope that, you know, what you see over time is that when breakthroughs are made and working conditions improve and often productivity does increase and profits don't fall, then that's a signal to others that this is possible. So I hope, as I said, that as we see more trials and more investigation of those trials by social scientists, we'll see the benefits of reducing working time for all.
Thank you. And we'll have a final one from Renata.
I did a study called But I Wouldn't Want My Wife to Work Here many years ago. I wonder if you could enlarge on the gender implications, because I found that Australia's much famed industrial legislation really had little impact on women's working conditions and women's working hours. And there was a great prejudice anyhow against women working. So I wonder if you considered that at all.
Yeah, well, so that's that is a major part of the book, is looking at those debates and experiences over time and how, you know, women in unions and beyond in the women's movement more broadly tried to bring these issues to attention, to demand action. And as I said in my talk, I mean, what I found sadly is that there's been a huge struggle that's, I think, had some success to change our understandings about work and how people talk about it and say they want to share work in the home, but there's been less genuine change. So I think that should be at the centre of our efforts when we think about the redistribution of work and the relationship between work and life. It's going to take institutional change, but as I said, it's also going to change the structures of the labour market, but it's also going to take a broader cultural shift and a social shift that affects the individual decisions we make about our lives, about how we raise our children, about how we work together.
Thank you so very, very much. If you could all put your hands together one more time for our wonderful speaker. So we are selling these books right here behind me. Rebecca will be able to help you with that, and I haven't asked, but I'm sure you'd be happy to sign some if people would like. I also, at the beginning, we don't normally acknowledge all the notables in the room because then that would just be a roll call. But I did want to note that we're joined by the old Executive Director, Emma Dawson, today. So this might be the last time you get to lobby her. Get over there. But yes, please come over here, buy a book. We'll be around for a couple more minutes. And thank you again so much for that. This work is really important, particularly now.